Hello, welcome back to Math Time with Professor Prime, and I'm your host as always, Professor Prime. And welcome back to my Math in the World series, the series where I talk about math and how it connects with and relates to different subjects. And these subjects can include, but are not limited to, different academic fields, different professional fields, personal interests, interests of my friends, my family, other people. Franchises, different concepts and ideas. The possibilities are endless. They are infinite. And today we are going to talk about math and animation. And if you can't tell right now, I'm feeling rather animated. Okay. So let's get into it. Math and animation. So the first thing is, when we think of animation, a lot of different things could come to mind. And, we might think of 2D animation, which is pretty traditional, but there are layers to that. And we might think of 3D animation, and there's also layers to that. It gets complicated, and there's a lot of math in it. And so I want to take this time today to talk about that, and then kind of talk about things in a meta sense too. So for me, animation has played such a crucial role in my life, whether it be used in a movie that I enjoyed, or a cartoon that I watched growing up, anime, you name it. And so the idea is, when I think of animation, one of the big things I think about is, well, motion, right? And when I think motion, if you're thinking about constructing a world and you want things to feel alive, you want them to move, and there's a lot of physics on that. And the idea with animation is to make it seem like, images are moving, to simulate motion. And honestly, you have to have motion to simulate motion, and that's fascinating. But the whole big thing is, so there's a lot of math and the physics of an animated world. And then animation itself, there's a lot of math and the physics of that. A lot of geometry too. And so I guess I kind of want to start at the beginning, so to speak. When you look at traditional like cell animation, for instance, you're drawing things out and you have your frames, and you might like have a slight movement here, slight movement there, and going from frame to frame. If you want to animate a particular sequence, you want to see how many frames is this going to take, and you want to have a good sense of the physics of what you're trying to animate. And there's math in all of that. And so you also want to think about how long it'll take to animate something. And for something that's even short, there could take a lot of work and time to make a short animation. So there's a lot of math to consider in all of that. And then, of course, over time, things have progressed, and animation is just used all across the board, and that's fascinating to me. That's interesting to me. So, like with the cell animation, you don't really see that too much anymore, but, or at least not like physically like how it was, because right now a lot of things that we see that used to be done with like cell animation, like actually physically having that, is done by software. And it kind of takes me into my next point, which is kind of like 3D animation. There's so much to that, and I think that's pretty cool because all the things that I said about 2D animation, applies there too, because you have to have a good sense of geometry, and in this case, three-dimensional geometry. You still have to have a good sense of physics and motion. And if you're using your computer to create something that's 2D, which is often the case now, you have to have a good sense of how that looks and operates and how things are going to function. And I think that's amazing, and there's just so much to it. There's so many different types of animation, and that's cool. And I could go on and on about it, but it's not just used in movies, right? It's used in our everyday life. Gaming is $1 billion industry, and it is all over that. From the 2D era into this 3D now, even into the VR, because now you not only have the physics and the geometry of that world, in addition to the physics and geometry of actually creating that world, but you also have code to consider, and that's in the 3D animation part too. But the idea is there's a lot of math and coding, and that's there too. And there's a lot of time, energy, and effort that goes into animation, and there's so many variables that you have to consider, and I think that's fascinating. And I wanted to talk about like some things that can get kind of crazy. So you have claymation, things like that, and that's pretty cool. like a lot of like stop motion animation. That's awesome. So you still have like physics and geometry to consider, but you also have like the models that you're making and how they'll flow and act to each other. So that's pretty cool. And yeah, so animation to me is so pivotal, and even in like minor ways that we might not think, it's animation. Well, one, mechanical animation, that's the thing. Think animatronics. I don't want to really go into that too far, but like I mean that counts. But more to some things that like you might not think about as animation, but it's definitely counting. I think GIFs. Like a lot of people are using more and more GIFs over time, and that's definitely animation. And then if you're like looking at movies and stuff like that, even in live action, you get animation, and you might not even register it as animation. And then that's a whole nother layer because you have some sort of like either something that you're making that you're going to animate, or just like some particular effect, and so you have to like work that in to like the live action world, and there's a lot of math in that, and I think it's all fascinating. And then if we kind of go um, into the meta context of it all and talk about that, I think that gets fascinating too, because of course you can't talk any of the things that we really talk about on this channel without talking about money, and you know that there's math in that. So with animation, it's an incredibly popular thing. It's used in everyday life. It's all over the place, and there's a lot of money to be made off of animated projects. And I think if you look at something like Disney, case in point, like they make a lot of money off of animation and always have, and even some of their live action stuff, of course, would feature it. And or they'll use some really innovative techniques, and it won't even really register to you that hey, animation was involved in this, but it absolutely is. And they've made billions upon billions of dollars off of it, and it's used in just a lot of things that we enjoy. Like I said earlier, video games, that's a big thing. There's a lot of money in video games. Like I said, it's a $1 billion industry, and there's a lot of money that goes into that. And so with all of this, I'm not going to just talk about like them making money, but I'd like to point out, while they're making money, they're considering budgets, and that affects everything. And in video games, there's some particular crazy stuff out there because you get things like the crunch, and there's some people out there who have done way more in-depth explanations than I'm about to do. But the idea is like you might have a deadline, and you might need to program this or that and do this and do that in your video game, and they might have you put in a lot of hours on a very, very specific amount of time. And if you're in video games, you're probably there because you enjoy it, and so you're going to do that probably because of your passion, but also because you could get fired or get a bad rep otherwise. And so if you're like a programmer or an animator or both, then you have to say like, oh, okay, well, so I'm in this field, I want to make my money, I want to make my project, but I also have to put in a ridiculous amount of hours to do it. And then it's like, well, how much are you getting compensated for that too? There's a lot of money in all of that. And then if the game comes out, they have a set price, and how it does, sometimes that's based on just reputation, because some games they will sell a lot no matter what, but some of it they need to build traction, and if you have a buggy, horrible mess, then that doesn't look good on you. So if things are poorly animated, that's a problem. If your character isn't moving right, that's a problem. And with animation in gaming, what I think about it, how it's implemented in there, it's one, yeah, and things like cutscenes, sure, because of course it is, right? But also the gameplay. You can't have gaming without animation. And given how much money goes into it, you have to really be careful and consider things and how it all comes together. And so that to me is fascinating. And another big industry I like is anime. And there is a lot of money to be made in that, a lot of issues in that too. Because, like, I mean, I'm sure some of you are watching, if you're an anime fan, I'm sure you've heard horror stories. And so I don't want these to get too long, so I'm going to try to focus in on what I want to say about it. But what I find interesting about anime is a lot of times it is manga based, right? And so you have some manga that's making a lot of money, and honestly, there's a lot of math that comes into making that manga. and if you're doing well, you're gonna get an anime, and that's awesome for a lot of shows anyway. And if I think about something big like Dragon Ball, for instance, well, right now its situation is very different. But back in the day when you had Dragon Ball and Dragon Ball Z, when those were animes, they had the manga to fall back on, and they used some frames as inspiration for animating things. Like, so they got a lot of what Toriyama did in his work, and they took painstaking efforts to animate that, and a lot of that took money, and sometimes they were on a budget, and sometimes they would source it to different studios. Some of the studios were awesome but costly. Some of them were cheap, and so you can't really escape math, money, and animation altogether. Um, and then you look at like how things are today, and it's like it's stressful. I think if you're like a new animator, because you have to do like a lot of work, and you might not be getting paid the best, but you're doing something you enjoy, but you're also like just putting so much time into what you're doing. And again, I'm not trying to get too sidetracked, but I guess my big thing I want to say is like when it comes to animation, when it comes to actually physically or digitally animating something, there's a lot of math in that process, because in addition to having to have a good understanding of physics and geometry with it, if not just intuitively, you also have to have an idea of what kind of story you're trying to tell, and you got to be able to map that out, and you also have to have a good idea about like how long this or that is going to take to animate, and what will the result be like how long will that result be, and there's varying degrees of perfection involved in what you do with that. And then with the worlds that you make, you have to consider all the math that goes into that and what makes sense there. And I just think that's all fascinating, and of course, like I said, there's the money aspect. It's all over the place, and you might have someone who is like really really precise with their animation, or they might be on some sort of team and everyone's working together and it's beautiful, but they might be on a budget and they might have to cut this and they might have to cut that, and you gotta figure it out if you're in that field what makes sense to you. And like I said, there's a lot of things in our regular life that use animation, so that's worth it to consider. And one of the things that I want to say before I close this out is, if you are someone who is interested in making, video games, or like, anime or something like that, things have changed so much. It's not like it used to be, because there's always like a big paywall or just like access to get into this or that. But we live in a world where a lot of people are making more and more things free, and so there still is a bit of a paywall in terms of like having the proper technology to use equipment. But I'm going to leave some links in the description with some software that I found that's free. Um, and there's some rings to that. Like there's OpenTunes, which Studio Ghibli uses some variation of that for the stuff that they've done over time, and that's free, open source, beautiful thing. Gonna leave a link for it, of course. And there's other things to consider, like there's RenPy, which it like creating a light novel engine, so that's pretty cool. And then like Unreal, the engine, there's like links to that, and that's free these days. They made that free I think a few years ago, maybe longer than that. But my whole point is just like, it's quite a time to be an animator, or if you have an interest in that, jumping into it and seeing how you feel about it. And the thing to consider is, so you can get past that paywall part, but then it's like, how much time are you going to put into this and that? And so it's like you'll have your software, and you still have to like illustrate things and like figure things out, and there's a lot of exciting math in that. And this went on longer than I intended, but I hope you got something out of it, and I hope you made that connection more with math and animation. And if there's any animators watching, I'm sure you could tell people, when you're in school, you have to do a lot of math classes or like math related activities. But yeah, so I hope people got something out of this, and I will see you all in the next video. I'll leave some links below with some really cool stuff. Professor Prime out.